This episode of Serverless Chats is sponsored by Lumigo. This week, Rebecca and I chat with Kesha Williams about serverless for salary transparency. This is Serverless Chats, episode number 114.
Hey everyone, I'm Rebecca Marshburn.
And I'm Jeremy Daly.
And you're listening to Serverless Chats.
Hey Rebecca, how are you doing? And I'm going to stop you before you start telling me about your weekend, because I know I'm always asking you how you're doing on your weekend. But I actually was curious if you had binged any shows lately or watched any interesting movies.
That's a great question. I have not really binged any shows. I'm much more of a lay on the couch and stare at the wall and listen to the same record over and over and over. It was actually something that really made my roommates in college mad. They'd be like, please just switch the side of the record.
It's probably better for your mental health.
But do you have anything that you recommend I should binge should I be in the market?
Well, I am, as you know, I am a soccer coach because I have two teenage daughters that play soccer. So the show that I've been watching lately has been Ted Lasso on Apple Plus, which is an absolutely amazing show. And it's more than just about soccer. It's like feel good, but also kind of delves into mental health and some of these other things. So anyways, really interesting show and super funny. Jason Sudeikis is hilarious in it. So anyways, that's something that I would recommend. All
right. Well, I'm wondering if the guest I'm about to introduce, who is a superhuman mother of three, I'm wondering if she has any similar experiences in terms of, sporting events and then how that sort of informs the types of shows that she likes to watch. But first, before we get to that question, I will introduce her. Our guest this week is an award-winning software engineer, an AWS Machine Learning Hero, a principal training architect for AWS at A Cloud Guru, which is now a Pluralsight company. Super exciting to see that transformation. And the creator of Salary Overflow, Kesha Williams. Hey, Kesha, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Rebecca and Jeremy. I'm super happy to be here.
Hey.
Now, as a mother of three, do you have any time to watch TV?
Well, my kids they're getting older now, so I do actually have time. But I remember those days, Jeremy, when all three of them played soccer, and my Saturdays were crazy.
Yeah, what's a Saturday, right?
Yeah, exactly. From one soccer game to the next soccer game on this side of town to the next side of town. It was fun. I do miss those days.
Yeah, I am trying to enjoy it because I know that soon it's going to be, they're going to be off somewhere else and I'm going to have nothing to do on Saturday. So
right.
I am enjoying it while it lasts.
That's good.
So to kick this off and to kick it off all the way back to the idea of childhood and remembering those days, Kesha, when talking about your own childhood, you said in one hand you had a Barbie doll, in the other hand you had a computer. And it seems like that led to an amazing journey in tech. You've had 26 years in tech and you've worked for the NSA and then you eventually moved to cloud. Can you give us a little bit of your background for context for our listeners?
Sure. So I've been in IT for 26 years. I honestly do not know where all of the time went because it's just been such a fun and exciting journey. And I really built the bulk of my career in the Java software engineering space. So this will date me, but I remember when Java came out because at the time I was doing C++ and I heard about this new language and I researched it. And when I learned about it, I thought this language is going to take over the world. I don't want to do C++ anymore. And so I actually left the organization where I was working at and I moved to Delta Airlines so that I could learn Java on the job. And I did that for a very, very long time. And throughout that time of doing Java web development, I held several titles like web developer, software engineer, technical lead, and then I eventually moved into a leadership position managing a team of engineers. And I would say about 7 or 8 years ago, I started to lose track of the time. Maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I was introduced to the cloud. And I really felt about the cloud how I felt about Java way back then. I'm like, okay, this is going to revolutionize how we deliver systems. And so I fell in love really with AWS. And then maybe 3 years ago, I started playing around with machine learning on AWS. And yeah, the rest is history.
Well, I think with the pandemic, we can add or subtract a year because we always, sort of forget 2020 even exists, or hopefully we can forget 2020 existed for some things, anyways. But so you've had obviously a very long career in tech. You've done a bunch of different things, like you said, moving from C++ to Java, then getting into the cloud, and there's just this whole array of different roles that you've held, whether they're in management positions or just being an engineer at some of these places. And I'm really curious because the everyone's journey in tech is different. And we hear a lot of people who, like, as you said, you started with a computer in one hand and a Barbie doll in the other. So you were into tech very young. A lot of people change later on in their careers. But one of the things that I think we know about tech, and this is just unfortunately one of these horrible labels that tech gets, is just that the diversity in tech is terrible, right? I mean, and that we've got salary discrepancies. We get people treated differently. There's people start at a company and then have a horrible experience because they're not a programmer, right? Like they have those experiences. So you created this thing called SalaryOverflow.com, and I'm really curious, like, just what were those experiences that you had that led you to creating this, and sort of what was the need for it?
Well, in tech, we always hear about this gender pay gap, and being an African American woman working in tech, I, firsthand have experienced that. So my very first experience with it was when I actually graduated from college and I was working my first job. And I remember, I believe it was like the first week, all of the new hires, we were sitting around the lunchroom table, just chit-chatting. And then somehow the topic about starting salaries came up. And as everyone went around the table discussing their starting salary, I realized that I was making like $20,000 less than everyone else. And so I was the only woman and the only person of color. And so for me, that was very eye-opening. And then as I just moved throughout my career and just throughout my journey, I would always notice that, like, my colleagues, they were able to take all of these expensive, lavish vacations. And for me, I was a single mom with a mother of three, but I was debt-free. And so I managed my money very well. And I was never able to, like, fly my kids off to Hawaii, and so that just made me think to myself, okay, they must make a lot more money than I do if they can afford those expensive vacations. And so because of my firsthand experiences, I wanted to do something to bring more transparency to salaries in tech, to hopefully just reduce that gender pay gap. And that's why I created that's one of the reasons why I created Salary Overflow. I also just love working on side projects to keep my skills current. Right. And so I wanted to play around with Amplify and some of the services on AWS that I had never used before. So I think Salary Overflow was a win-win.
Okay, so there are so many underlying foundational themes that I am really eager to address there. But before we get too far into that, let's talk a bit about you went from Java and then you found, or you're in, like you write, you prefer Java, but then you found the AWS cloud, right? And you're like, this is going to transform the way we work. And then within the last 7 to 8 years, you have become a machine learning hero and an Alexa champion. And you've become like a voice not only for teaching others how to use these successfully, but also as an advocate to say, like, hey, this is as a African American woman of color, there's not enough diversity. Like, there should be more than just like me as the face of this. Before we go too far into some of those other meatier topics I'd love to dive into, we kind of know why you started in Java. What prompted you to start with cloud? Like, what made you think that cloud was the future?
Well, for me, as I've always considered myself a software engineer, developing and building and bringing ideas to life. When I was introduced to AWS, I realized that I didn't need a team to build or bring these ideas to life. I could use AWS to quickly, like literally in a matter of weeks, build an application that normally it would take a team of 5 developers to build over several months. So that's really what got me excited about the cloud. Just for me, my ability to quickly innovate and deploy solutions to production, it's amazing. That's why I love AWS.
So the idea of AWS being this vehicle for, small teams or single developers to be able to build these massive things is sort of, I think, interesting to the way that AWS has brought machine learning to the forefront with all the SageMaker tools and all the different things. So, maybe you can expand a little bit on that, because I know you've only been doing machine learning for maybe 3 or 4 years, which is 3 or 4 more years than I've been really doing it. So, I basically use the APIs. That's where that's about the extent that I go with machine learning. But what was it about the openness or the availability of tools or so forth that even let you get into machine learning? Because I'm thinking, normally you'd be running massive EC2 instances and things like that. Just what are some of those things that made it easy for you to kind of explore machine learning?
Right. And I always tell people, if it weren't for AWS, I would have never gotten into machine learning. So when I initially started wanting to learn about machine learning, again, I always find excitement in these technologies. So first it was Java, then it was cloud, and then machine learning. And again, I just feel like machine learning is this disruptive technology that is just going to continue to impact our lives on a daily basis. And so I wanted to learn more about it. And when I first started my journey, of course, I went to AWS, and there was a service called AWS Machine Learning. Nice name. And that service is no longer available to new developers. But for me at the time, I was just starting to explore machine learning, and it really abstracted away a lot of the deep technical details. And it just gave me an easy way to get started. And it made the topic very approachable. So I wasn't afraid, because before I always felt like you had to be a research scientist working in a lab somewhere in order to even understand and use machine learning. But with that AWS machine learning service, it was a great introduction. And there, once I became comfortable, I understood the machine learning lifecycle, I understood just all of the machine learning concepts. Then I started to explore and dig deeper, and that's when I started learning using SageMaker. Right. And then SageMaker just allowed me to continue to peel back those layers and go deeper and deeper and deeper until I was actually ready to start writing my own custom training code. And so I think for me, that was the great benefit of AWS. I was able to start at this very high level and just start peeling back the layers to get really deep and really technical. And it was something that I could do on my own time. Right. And it just made it very easy. Like I said, if it weren't for AWS, I would not be a machine learning hero. I would not have worked with machine learning. And
you don't need to be like a rocket scientist, right? You don't need to be like you don't need a PhD in math to do some of this stuff. I remember very early on trying to play around with TensorFlow or what, and I was just like, all right, 8th grade algebra, I can help my kid with her homework, but once I get past that, I really got to start thinking about it.
Yeah, and I will say I did have to learn Python. And to this day, I still want to put a semicolon on the end of all of my Python lines of code, and I still don't get this indentation. Like, why?
Oh, yeah, no, it's like YAML, right? Indentation is important.
So I was talking to Jeremy before, obviously before we're interviewing you right now, and I was like, oh man, I got so into watching Kesha's videos and so much of her content that I almost forgot to come back and form questions, because I was getting sucked into all of them. I love doing research on guests, but yours were particularly compelling. And one of the talks that I really liked is the one you gave in 2019 at reInvent, Future Proof Your Career, Java Developer to Machine Learning Practitioner. Mm-hmm. And in it, you really lay out the levels of adoption, which it sounds like you sort of just walked us through your own path. but the levels quickly that you lay out are level 1. You're using recognition and poly and lex, and you're using ML models created by others. And then level 2, you make your own models, which was like AWS machine learning, and now it's basically been crafted into SageMaker. Right. And then there's level 3, where you use toolkits and interfaces and frameworks to write your own learning algorithms. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more perhaps about the leaps that maybe you needed to make personally, or that you see others need to make in order to sort of up level.
Right. So if you're trying to start with machine learning, definitely learn the concepts. So like the very high level concepts, like what is a model? When someone says they need to train a model, what does that mean? And so once you learn like the machine learning, I call it the machine learning life cycle, then you're able to actually implement that life cycle using tools. And so that's how I always tell people to get started. First, start with just the very high level concepts. And then once you're good with those concepts, just continue to peel back the layers and go deeper and deeper and deeper. And like I said, all of the tools and services on AWS allow you to be as high level or as detailed as you want to be.
This is a question that I think relates maybe back to Salary Overflow, but this idea of like what it means to be a minority in tech, and something with machine learning, right, that we hear so often, or like science and technology studies more broadly, is if you put bad information in, you're going to get bad information out. And so there's this like, how do you create, when you're at that level 3 and you're writing your own machine learning algorithms, how do you create algorithms that have as little bias, ideal state, no bias as possible? And I'm wondering, as being both a woman and a minority and African American woman in tech, if you approach writing your algorithms perhaps differently than you've seen others approach it, or if you've found different ways that your algorithms maybe come out a little differently because of your previous experience, because of your life experience.
Right. So that's something to me that's very important when we talk about the bias in machine learning. So I can tell you about the very first machine learning model that I developed. It was used to predict crime. And the data that I've found that was freely available was UK crime data. And one of the data points in that was race. And so when I was building my machine learning model to predict crime, because I'm an African American, I personally decided to take race out of the equation. Now, someone else may not have considered doing that if they've had a different experience. And so I think whenever we're building machine learning models, you really need to have a diverse team so that certain things are considered upfront when we look at the data, when we test the model, because we've heard and seen several horror stories about computer vision, anything related to machine learning having a bias. So yeah, it's very important, especially how we utilize machine learning today in our lives. It's very important to build models and solutions without bias.
Yeah.
Do you see anyone doing it well today, or do you see perhaps companies or individuals who are, teachers and educators around building algorithms that are like setting up much better guardrails or like criteria to be like, hey, this is actually going to get you an algorithm that's going to return something that has a ton of bias in it? Like, are there any great resources that you would recommend in terms of building better unbiased algorithms?
Well, I can tell you, I jumped for joy, like literally jumped for joy when SageMaker Clarify was released at reInvent last year. And I was just like, yes, this is a great first step to make sure the models that we're building are bias free. And so I was just really happy to see AWS make that a service, part of SageMaker, and just making it available, and just even recognizing that it's an issue and it's something that we need to address. So I would say definitely, if you're building machine learning solutions on AWS, incorporate SageMaker Clarify into your solution.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, so there's clearly bias. We know this in machine learning. I mean, a lot of these, you mentioned the visualization stuff. Not being able to detect different skin type or skin colors with facial recognition and things like that. And again, part of it is because the test sets, right? Like who's actually building it, who's testing it. All of that bias comes through, and I don't think all of it's intentional. I think some of it, it just happens because people don't think about it the way that somebody with different experiences might think about it.
Right.
And I want to take that. I want to, kind of pull the thread a little bit on the idea of bias. And you mentioned this early on. This idea of you making $20,000 less than everybody else sitting at that table. Those biases come in again, whether they're intentional or non-intentional, whatever. The point is it exists, right? So regardless of how it happens, it's there. It's systematic, and it's just in the system now, where no matter what you do, you're going to see those biases come through when it comes to salary data. So let's dive more into Salary Overflow a little bit. You kind of mentioned the reasons why you wanted to build it, but let's actually talk about what it actually is and what it actually does.
Sure. So Salary Overflow is a web application. Right now, it's in the initial, I call it the data collection phase, where you're able to go in and enter your salary information and then search to see the additional salaries within the system. And so it's broken down by location, job title, and the salary amount being paid. And so that's the first phase. I call it the data collection phase. And honestly, I put it out there just to see. It was more of the MVP, and the response that I received was very overwhelming. And so it made me realize that, yes, this is something that's very important.
Right.
And I even had a company reach out to try to buy the IP, but I decided to hold on to it because I have just so many just amazing and just exciting plans for the next phase of the application. Definitely, I want to incorporate machine learning to make salary predictions. I want to incorporate a salary negotiation piece to help people better negotiate salaries. I want to have reports. So, I imagine there's a woman out there, she has this job offer in hand, and she really wants to know if she's being paid fairly. She can go into Salary Overflow, print a report for that same job title, same location, same years of experience, and say, hey, look, you are paying me $10,000 under the market, and it would help her negotiate her salary. So I just get really excited when I think about the future of Salary Overflow and how it can help people.
Well, it'd be interesting to have a feedback loop in there as well, to say, if somebody did get a job offer that was below market rate or whatever, to report that back into the system that you got an offer from this specific company or whatever, and you could kind of do some of that as well. And
yes,
you could maybe even
really
rate
cool.
companies on their transparency levels.
I need to get a notepad. I like that. I like that idea too.
Write it down. Write it down. So there's a lot. Your reason for doing this clearly is amazing, and this is just really needs to be done. But we're a serverless podcast, so I would be remiss if I didn't ask about the architecture that you're using, because you built this using all serverless stuff, right?
Yes, and I really relied on AWS Amplify. So I wanted to experiment with this full stack development, web application development tool that came out. And so with AWS Amplify, you're able to really speed up the delivery of a web application. And so the front end of the application currently is served up through S3 and CloudFront. And then the user authentication, I use Cognito. And then between the database and the front end, I'm using AppSync. That was my very first time using AppSync and GraphQL. I'm usually a REST person. And I found GraphQL to be very flexible. And then on the back end, I'm using Aurora Serverless. And so there's also a Lambda function in there as well. Whenever there's a new user that signs up, I use a Lambda function to create a record in that database. But yeah, just the overall experience and flow. And also, this is my first time using React. So I use React on the front end. I'm typically an Angular person. So it was just a
we
great...
we won't hold that against you.
It was just a great overall experience, and I was able to learn a lot of, new tools and technology. So, yeah.
So I'm wondering, with that, have any of those services catapulted into being your favorite AWS services? Or is there anything where you're like, hey, I'm actually not going to build an app without Amplify again, because it is this full stack experience and it enabled me to learn these things, interact with these services, not have to know too much. Or I shouldn't say know too much, but you can start from the starting point.
Right. So I really love Amplify. I'm a huge Amplify fan. And there's even a component in there that there's the automatic CI/CD. So if you hook it into your version control system, as you merge changes to, let's say, so I have a dev, test, and prod branch. As I merge changes, it automatically deploys my code to production. And so that was really built in to Amplify. And so it just gives you this whole experience for developing and deploying applications, I call the right way. And so I am definitely an AWS Amplify fan, a huge fan.
I know some teammates on the Amplify team, and they're like, yes,
I
us too.
love it.
Yes,
I love it.
Speak it.
We just had a conversation with Ali Spittle, who's on the
oh, really?
She's the developer advocate for the lead developer advocate for that team, and yeah, we
Awesome.
just had a great episode with her as well. Hi, everyone. I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Lumigo. We've talked a lot about observability on this podcast, and if you've listened to any of those episodes, then you know that it can be difficult to achieve serverless observability with traditional approaches. Though serverless comes with many opportunities and advantages, it also has some unique issues that some tools just aren't able to address, and those issues really need something meant for serverless environments. That's where Lumigo comes in. As a serverless-first monitoring platform, Lumigo lets developers quickly and easily find and fix errors and performance issues while also giving you an end-to-end view of the entire transaction across services and functions. All of the debugging information you need is conveniently in one place, and you're able to set up alerts so that you know what's happening and how it might affect the user experience. Lumigo also knows how to play nice with your existing toolchain, enabling you to send alerts to email, Slack, Microsoft Teams, Ops Genie, and more, and can also create tickets in Jira straight from the issues page. Thanks to their automatic distributed tracing, it only takes 4 clicks to set up Lumigo with no manual code changes necessary. Sign up for free at lumigo.io. So you mentioned speed a number of times, just get you where you're going fast.
Right.
Clearly, launching EC2 instances or even setting up containers and doing some of the other things. Just how much productivity do you think you gained from using a serverless approach? And clearly, Amplify is serverless approach, on steroids. But what type of productivity gains do you think there are here for developers that are, that are traditional EC2 VM people or container people moving to something more serverless?
Well, I can tell you with the Salary Overflow application, the MVP, I was able to have that finished in a matter of weeks. Literally a matter of weeks. It was in production. Not even 2 weeks. So that's why, I quickly did it. I put it out there to see if anyone would find it valuable. And now, when I look at the UI, so I told you, this is my very first time using React. And so it's a very basic UI. And now I'm like, okay, I can really, take this to the next level because people actually like it.
Yeah, and for those who haven't experienced Salary Overflow, it is, even if it's a basic UI, you go in and you have to create your user first before you see some of this data, and you get an SMS message, right, with a passcode, and then you enter the passcode, and then it returns you to the sign in, and then you have your username created and your password, and then you get in and you get to start seeing this data. But while it may seem, basic to someone who's a programmer, I think for a lot of people, you're like, that's actually a considerable amount of work to make that flow happen so
That's true.
seamlessly.
That is true.
And to like onboard someone onto some sort of product. And so I do think that you probably are not even giving yourself enough credit in terms of being able to set that up in a matter of weeks. And that's only the onboarding flow, right? Before you even get into the data and the reports and ingesting all of this data and all of that. So I highly recommend people to check it out.
And also, I just say too, I have built a lot of React or Vue apps as well, and I am not a designer, so they always look clunky and basic and whatever. And it always irks me a little bit when that designer lays this nice little skin over, and you're like, how did you make it look so good? Like,
I know that
if you're not a designer like me, anything that looks basic, there's a lot happening back there. I can attest to that. But yeah, it doesn't always look as great as we want it to. But props to designers who can do that and make things look so beautiful.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I wanted to dive in a little bit more. I know that Amplify, as full stack, also has databases that it's going to already use, and it's using Aurora. And I was wondering though, when we go back to machine learning in general and the amount of data that you have to ingest. And then it's not only that, right? It's like ingesting it, and then you have to clean it and format it, transform it. You have to check it. I'm wondering if outside of Amplify and what would be like coming in that full stack experience, if there are databases that you love to use for machine learning data in general, and what you see in terms of pros, cons, benefits, advantages, disadvantages to different databases for performing all of that on your data.
So specifically for machine learning, I use S3. So I don't really use an official database. So S3, when you think about SageMaker, SageMaker just integrates really natively with S3. And so that's how I store for machine learning. That's how I store all of my data.
I love that. The classic.
And S3, by the way, it's kind of its own database. I mean, people don't think of it as a database, but it's like a key value store that can just store massive amounts of data. And also with like S3 Select and some of those other things, like you can actually run queries on it. So so it's not as good as a database as Amazon Route 53 is, but I mean, it's still, as Corey Quinn would say. So let's talk about entrepreneurship a little bit, because you mentioned you had an offer to buy Salary Overflow. And I'm just curious in terms of like, for other people that are building, and you mentioned, the speed is there, and you don't need a bunch of people to build this. It can be a single person that can actually get something up and running really fast. But for those people who are looking to do this, because the cloud enables so much. It's amazing what the cloud enables you to do now, especially for the small teams, like you said, especially for the kid who wants to get on the free tier and sitting in their dorm room somewhere, and she can build a whole app or whatever, and it costs $10 maybe to run it. So just in terms of people who are looking, or some advice, maybe some thoughts, some recommendations, some learnings, whatever, that as you've gone through this process, what would you want to say to people who are thinking about starting on AWS and building a startup idea?
I would say definitely start with just understanding all of the services out there and what's available to you. You don't have to go deep, but just at a high level, know what's available. And so I always direct people to start with like the certified cloud practitioner, like that level of knowledge. Especially as an entrepreneur, I would recommend that you not always rely on like a technical person to just come in and work their magic and then just leave you with everything. Just really try to understand just the basics of the technology, what's available, and then go from there. So yeah, I would definitely recommend with just understanding the basics of AWS, and then you can start to architect your system and work with solutions architects to help you kind of architect your system. And, when they talk all of their tech jargon, you'll understand what they're talking about, and they'll think you're really smart.
And there's probably a few courses they can take over at A Cloud Guru that would help you out with that.
Definitely. You can take my certified solutions, my CCP course. You can take that course, and it's a great, fun introduction to AWS.
when I first started working at AWS, or I'm no longer there now, but I was there for about 4 years. And so I guess I started in 2016. And I still have my book when I took a Cloud Guru's like introduction to AWS, or like the 12 to 15 hour course. And then I was looking at Lambda and Serverless and some of the other like specific courses.
Nice.
But I still have my notebook that has like this many. Well, I guess listeners can't see. I'm holding my hands really far away from each other. It's a really thick book of notes. And I did find it so helpful to even introduce me to the vocabulary that I didn't know I didn't know to start having those conversations.
Right. That's awesome.
Yeah, it is definitely. Yeah. So, Kesha, I really admire what you're doing with Salary Overflow. And when I opened my email this morning, I thought it was very apropos that this person, Lenny Rachitsky, who has Lenny's newsletter, and it's a newsletter that basically offers advice to people in the tech world and the PM world. Anyway, his edition today featured Naya Dragova. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but it's a co-founder of Candor. And the whole theme around the newsletter was the 10 Commandments of Salary Negotiation.
Oh, you have to forward that to me.
I will. I'll absolutely forward it to you. And it's pretty cool. It has 10 steps around hey, this is what you're going to experience across all these moments. And negotiation actually starts earlier than you think. And here's what the recruiter is going to ask you around, let's say, before they start conversations with a team, right? They say, or before they start interviews, the recruiter might say, okay, what are you looking for as a number? And then Naya recommends hey, you don't give a number. You say, I'd love to meet the team. I would love to know what your salary band is. Right. So it's more about how to diplomatically, but advocate for yourself even early in the process before you try to start advocating for yourself what is actually step 8 out of 10. Right. So I'll definitely forward that to you. And I found it just so lovely that I opened that this morning when we were going to be having this Salary Overflow talk today with you. And I'm wondering if there are moments or places where you yourself go for learning and educational resources around salary best practices, negotiation best practices, or other ways that you look for things to influence or shape the way that you build your own app. Or anything you could recommend to folks around where should I go to learn more about how to advocate for myself when it comes to compensation?
Well, for me, it's really built off of, I guess, my 26 years of experience in tech and interviewing and just being in the industry for so long. What I always recommend to people, and I still do this now, even if you're not looking for a job, but maybe in 5 years, I'd like to be a senior software engineer. I often just look at the current job openings out there, the job postings, to see what the salary range is. Not every single job will tell you what the range is, but a lot of them do. So I think it's very important for you to kind of know your industry and know what the different job titles pay. And job postings is a great way to do that. And of course, Salary Overflow.
It's an interesting approach that I love. It's essentially working backwards, right? From where you think you might want to go and then understanding all of the goalposts or milestones along the way rather than learning them once you get there. Right. That's a really great idea. Yeah.
And I'm a little bit curious too how, and maybe this is some data that you've been collecting as well, but how geography sort of plays into salary as well. I mean, it used to be very much so if you lived in Boston and you worked in Boston, or you lived in San Francisco and you worked in San Francisco, you'd have much higher salaries than if you worked in, some suburb of Columbus or something like that. Right. And I'm curious if, especially with the world shifting to so much remote, you're now able to hire somebody from Oklahoma, who is a brilliant programmer, and he or she, it has a much lower cost of living, but how does that affect salaries? And are you seeing any companies, and maybe this is just, I don't know if you've got this data, if you've dug into it yet, but is that something, one, have you seen companies paying, equitable wages across geographies, or do you think they should?
I definitely think you should be paid based on the work that you're doing. And so I remember when this pandemic started and everybody was working from home, and then some people took that as an opportunity. Let's say they lived in San Francisco and now they wanted to move to Florida, and some company saying, "Oh, you're moving to Florida? Well, guess what? You're going to get paid less." I don't think that's the right approach. Now, I do believe that I'm going to start seeing a change in the salary data that's being entered into Salary Overflow, because a lot of people are starting to, work from home now because of the pandemic. Right now, the data is still showing, I guess I call it the old way, the pre-pandemic world, where if you work in California, you're paid more than, let's say, you work in Florida. I don't know why I keep going to Florida. I live in Georgia. Maybe I want to visit Florida. But I do think we're going to start seeing this shift in the salary data. But I want to see it shift to where you're paid for the job that you're doing.
Right. Yeah, people should be paid what they're worth, right? That's always one of those things where it always bothered me when it's like, especially overseas, when you have people say like, "Oh, well, we can get these programmers for, $12 an hour," or something like that. I was always like, it doesn't seem like that's the approach that you want to take when you're hiring people.
Yeah.
I'm curious too with your work on Salary Overflow. You said that someone wanted to buy your IP. I can only imagine that while that's one instance, I'm sure a lot of companies, or I guess I hope a lot of companies, are at least contacting you to better understand their own practices, perhaps, or do you have people reaching out in terms of advice or consulting, or just taking a hard look at themselves, or is that something that you want to do if that's not happening right now?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the future phases of Salary Overflow, where corporations can see or visualize their own data in the system. And if they want to ask the question, well, how well do we pay African American women coders? Or how can we compare that to what we pay like male coders? So that is definitely a goal and a dream of mine, for organizations to be able to visualize their own data and answer those questions using Salary Overflow.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, Kesha, listen, this has been great. This is awesome stuff that you're working on. I hope all of these future enhancements, maybe not the ML stuff, but everything else, will continue to use serverless.
Of course.
If people want to get a hold of you on Twitter or anywhere else, or learn more about the courses you teach for A Cloud Guru, check out Stack Overflow. Check out Salary Overflow. How do they do that?
And before I answer that, the funny thing is that's why I named Salary Overflow. Because when you think about Stack Overflow, now when you switch that to Salary Overflow, it's the one place you go when you have questions about your salary.
Brilliant. So, yeah. Brilliant.
It is brilliant. I actually caught that. I was like, I think I know the nod she's making. It's a great nod.
Yep. And you can find me on social media. On Twitter, it's Kesha, Kesha Wills, Willz, or Z if you're in the UK. And LinkedIn, I always fuss at myself for making this my LinkedIn, but it's Java Rockstar Kesha.
I think it's the perfect title. I think it's perfect.
That was a long time ago.
Surfer Girl 87 over here.
See, I would have chosen a name like that and then showed my kids just as like a dad joke. I would have been like, yep.
Yeah, and I feel like it's too late to change it now, because that link is everywhere.
Everywhere, right.
Everywhere.
Kesha, that's going to be an NFT not too long from now. It's like the screenshot of the URL of Kesha's LinkedIn. Like that's excellent. You are just future-proofing your career again right now.
And then Salary Overflow is just salaryoverflow.com. Yep. And then Kesha.tech is your other blog there. And yes. We will put all of this stuff in the show notes too, so listeners can go and find links to all the amazing things that you have done. Thanks again for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
And that's this week's Serverless Chat. Rebecca and I want to give a huge thank you to Kesha Williams for being our guest this week, and to our sponsor, Lumigo. If you want to check out the show notes and a full transcript of this episode, you can find them at serverlesschats.com/114. For more Serverless Chats, subscribe, sign up to be an insider, check us out on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can connect with Rebecca on Twitter at Becca Odelay and me at Jeremy_Daily. And if you want to keep up to date on everything serverless, make sure you subscribe to the Off by None newsletter at offbynone.io. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to chatting with all of you again next week.